Hello, Year 11. I'm going to talk you through some beliefs about Brahman for our paper 1 and the Hinduism section. So I'm going to talk through some basic subject knowledge, some additional extras that could be useful for 12 markers or for those of you going for the grade 7 to 9. And then we're going to look at some possible exam questions. So first of all, we need to answer the question, what is Brahman? So I'll let you read my description on screen. So Brahman is the source of all life and the universe itself. It's the most real thing and is often described as being formless, limitless, and beyond human understanding. On the specification, there are 2 words that you need to be able to use to describe different approaches to understanding Brahman, and they are Nirguna and Saguna. If you're making yourself quiz cards, this would be essential information on those quiz cards. So Nirguna is Brahman without qualities. I remember that because N stands for no, and it's no qualities. And then Saguna is Brahman with qualities. So Brahman with a particular quality like love, or Brahman seen through a personal deity, such as a member of the Trimurti. And I remember Saguna because S means plural, and Brahman Saguna has many qualities. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on each of these in a moment. But for now, Nirguna, no qualities. Saguna, Brahman with qualities. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail at Brahman Nirguna. So Brahman, no qualities. I will let you read what's written on screen. Remember that black is the basic information, red is extra. So you're probably recognizing some of the words that were on our initial slide. So Nirguna Brahman is Brahman without shape, without form, without attributes. So not Brahman that can be drawn or summed up in human words. So very much the idea of Brahman that is beyond human understanding, because it's beyond anything that we experience. And although it is Brahman beyond human understanding, that doesn't mean that you don't try to understand Nirguna Brahman. And so this way of understanding Brahman is very much a focus of the path to Brahman that's focused on knowledge, which is Jnana Yoga, but also meditation or Ashtanga Yoga. And in the Upanishads, which is a very philosophical scripture, Brahman is very much presented in this way. And so there's a quote from the Upanishads that teaches that Brahman is not this and not that. So beyond anything that humans experience. Now, if you're a great philosopher, that way of understanding Brahman might appeal to you. But for many other people, Saguna Brahman, Brahman with qualities, makes Brahman much easier to relate to, understand, and worship. And so again, I will let you read this. The black is the basic information, the red is the extra. And so this is seeing Brahman as having particular qualities that we can relate to because we see them, albeit in a much more limited form, in the world around us. So love, power, wisdom. But it's also viewing Brahman through one of the deities such as Vishnu or Shiva or Lakshmi. And so because you have an image of that deity and you have a story of that deity, it makes Brahman easier to understand. And so this way of understanding Brahman, Saguna Brahman, is particularly associated with Bhakti Yoga. So that's about getting close to Brahman through devotion. And so you might devote and show love towards Vishnu or Krishna, for example. And that's Brahman with qualities, Saguna Brahman. And again, if we look at the stories, so things like the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana and the Puranas, where we've got stories of particular deities, again, that's Saguna Brahman. Another way of understanding Brahman, and again, this is on the specification, is by thinking about Brahman in your heart. So again, I will give us some time to read and then I'll add a little bit of explanation. So this is the idea that Brahman can be found within every living person, in fact, every living being, and that's Atman. And the goal of pathways like Ashtanga yoga or meditation is realizing that Brahman is within you. And so gaining spiritual wisdom is about realizing that Brahman and your soul are at one. And this can influence Hindus because it can lead them to show a real respect for all life, and not just human life, but all living life. Because Brahman is within everything that's living. And it supports beliefs like ahimsa, non-violence, and compassion. And a nice quote that expresses this idea, again from the Upanishads, is the self that is in the heart is Brahman. So the self, the Atman, is Brahman. And so this Upanishad is the one that's mentioned on the specification. Now, I can't imagine you're going to have to name this Upanishad, but it might ask you what it teaches about Brahman. And in this Upanishad, there is a story where a teacher is asked how many gods exist. And the teacher or the sage starts with the answer 3003 and gradually gets down to one. And so this is teaching Hindus that the many gods or deities that you come across are aspects of the one ultimate reality, Brahman. I'll let you read what's on screen and then I will add a little bit more explanation. So this Upanishad does teach that Brahman is limitless, without form, etc. But there's also this idea that the many gods or the many deities that are spoken about are all aspects, different ways of understanding Brahman. And it's very hard to find a theism, if you like, that matches Hinduism. But perhaps the closest we might get to what's being presented here is monism, the idea that there is one reality that underpins everything else. So there are a diversity of deities, but behind them is the one being, Brahman. One reality is monism. And this approach encourages that pluralism and respect for diversity of worship and belief that we often talk about in lessons when we're talking about Hinduism or Hindu Dharma. So now I'm going to have a look at some exam questions. So a 2-marker could say, give 2 features of the divine. Now this can be quite a confusing question because it isn't saying Brahman, but that's what it means. So give 2 features of the divine. And so you could have eternal or beyond human understanding. And remember, you don't want to write full sentences for these questions, you want bullet points. I've then got a 4-marker. So this one is asking, explain 2 ways in which believing that Brahman can be shown without form, Nirguna, influences Hindus today. So I'm going to let you read my answer, and I'm just going to pull bits out that make this a successful answer. Okay, so I want you to notice, first of all, that I've got 2 paragraphs. I'm making it easier for the examiner to give me full marks. And I've got one way and another way. I've then linked back to the question. So I've spoken about Brahman without form, or I've used the word Nirguna. And then to get full marks, I need some additional detail or explanation. So in the first paragraph, to get my 2 marks, I've spoken about how meditation might help a Hindu understand Brahman Nirguna. And so for that reason, they might spend time meditating and chanting. Then in my second paragraph, I've said that because Brahman Nirguna is so hard to understand, it would encourage them to follow the path of knowledge, of jnana yoga, because you need that deep study of scriptures to understand a being that's beyond human understanding. So that's my 4-marker. So now I've got a 5-marker. So remember that in a 5-marker, you need to have a clear reference to a Hindu scripture or story. And I always say, as long as you're not spending lots of time trying to think of the second scripture or teaching, it's a good idea to have a scripture or teaching in each paragraph so that if one doesn't work, the second will. However, please don't spend ages trying to think of your second scripture or source of wisdom. If it's not there, move on and start getting marks on another question. So this question says, explain 2 Hindu teachings about Brahman and refer to sacred writings. So I will let you read what I have written. Okay, so again, you can see that I've echoed the question. So it says explain 2 Hindu teachings. So I've got 2 clear paragraphs. I've got one teaching and another teaching. It's about Brahman, and so Brahman is all over my answer. Would be odd if it wasn't. And then I've used 2 scriptures. They're both from the Upanishads. That doesn't matter. I don't need to know scriptures or stories word for word. So first of all, I've used that story where the wise teacher is asked how many gods there are, and he starts at 3003 and goes all the way down to 1. I don't need to detail that story in great detail. I haven't got time. And if I was being honest, I couldn't remember the numbers that were given. And so you want a quick summary of the story on what it teaches about Brahman. And so I've said this shows that all gods are part of the one ultimate reality, which is Brahman. And then my second source of wisdom, again, is the Upanishads, and it's the idea that the self is in the heart, is Brahman. And so this is showing that within every person is Atman, which is Brahman. So the divine is present in everyone and everything. So I'm playing it safe by having a scripture in both parts of my answer. But if I couldn't think of a second scripture, I'm going to move on. Doesn't matter that I've used the Upanishads for both paragraphs. It doesn't matter if you can't quote exactly. So now I've got a 12 marker. And so this is saying Brahman is beyond human understanding. So some of you might find it useful at the beginning of this to say that this statement is asking whether humans can understand Brahman or not. I've then followed my ABCD structure. So I've got my argument, and then I've backed it up. I've then challenged or given a counter argument, and I've reached a decision. So I will let you read what is on screen, and then I will pull out some explanation. Okay, so my first answer is yes, Brahman Nirguna is beyond human understanding. And then I've backed that up with a quote from the Upanishads. I haven't got it word from word. I couldn't remember it if I'm being honest, but I know that the Upanishads teach that Brahman is beyond words and thought. And then my counter argument is the idea that many Hindus believe in Saguna Brahman, Brahman with qualities, and that is easier for humans to understand. And I've given some examples. So, for example, Vaishnavites would use stories from the Bhagavad Gita or stories about Krishna to try and understand Brahman through the lens of Vishnu or through the lens of Krishna. And the use of those stories and symbols, etc., makes Brahman easier to understand. And so perhaps if you're a follower of Saguna Brahman, that you would say Brahman isn't completely beyond my understanding. And then I've got my next argument, which is that yes, Brahman can feel beyond human understanding, but there are different pathways to Brahman, and we can choose the one that helps us understand perhaps an aspect of him. And so I want to make sure that this section is different from what I've said previously. So rather than focusing on the stories, I'm now focusing on a different pathway to God. And so I talk about bhakti yoga, and so being personally devoted to a form of Brahman, again, such as Vishnu. I could also say, and I'm deliberately weaving in lots of key words here, that reading the scriptures, jnana yoga, meditating, Ashtanga yoga, can also help humans gain an insight into Brahman. And then I've got another quote here from the Bhagavad Gita: to those who are devoted, I give understanding. And then I've got my counter argument, which says, well, yes, reading stories, meditating, etc., they can help you get insights into Brahman, but Brahman still remains this mysterious and infinite being. And so you might get a little understanding of Brahman, but not a complete understanding. And I've used that quote that I mentioned earlier in this presentation, again from the Upanishads: the Brahman is not this and not that. And then it's important that my conclusion draws on what I have said previously and links back with the question. So I'm inviting you now, just take a minute to read my conclusion that's in green at the bottom of the page. So the word Brahman appears again and again in the conclusion, as does beyond human understanding. And so I'm concluding that yes, we can get insights into Brahman through scripture or meditation, but he always remains beyond full human understanding. And I've linked that with the Upanishads. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much.